Now I want to start with Android development, and to build your app for Android or iOS, I will use Capacitor. Now you can actually use Capacitor or Cordova. Both are tools that in the end can take a web app and wrap it into a native app. Cordova has been around for a couple of years, and in the past Ionic only used Cordova. It still fully supports it, but the Ionic team now also built their own tool, Capacitor, which does essentially the same but gives you, in my opinion, nicer API. And in this course, we'll use Capacitor, which is under heavy development and will probably see quite an exciting future. You can learn more about Capacitor on capacitor.ionicframework.com. And there, in the docs, you also learn all about how to use it, how to tap into native device features, and so on. Things we'll do later. But you also learn how to set up your machine to be able to build for Android and iOS. To start with Android, here, under Android, click on Getting Started, and there you'll learn how to configure your machine to build Android apps. What you'll learn here is that you need to install the Android SDK, the Android SDK tools or build tools in this version or higher, and this might change over time, so definitely check this page out. And you need the Android SDK platform, API 21 or greater. Now this is all installed automatically, or you're asked to install it automatically when you do install Android Studio. And Android Studio is a tool you need as well. You can Google for Android Studio to find a link to its official page. And there you can download Android Studio onto your machine and then walk through the installer. Android Studio is the official Android development environment and will not write code in Android Studio, but we will use it as a build tool. So Ionic Capacitor will use it behind the scenes to create that native app wrapper into which it injects your mobile app, you could say. So therefore, you should download Android Studio from this Android Studio page, and this will give you an installer for Mac and Windows and Linux through which you can walk. Now, when going through that installer, make sure you do install the Android SDK tools and the Android SDK platform as instructed here. And if you don't do that during the installation, you can still do it thereafter from inside Android Studio. I already do have it installed by going to Configure, SDK Manager there. And then here, you want to choose an SDK which has at least version 21 or higher. And under SDK Tools, you want to install these Android SDK build tools here. You also want to install the Android SDK tools here in the latest version you see, and the platform tools as well. I also recommend installing that emulator, that Hexam installer here, to speed up your emulator if you're running an Android emulator to test your app on. Basically, you can also set all the other check marks you see here, and also make sure you do install the Android emulator. I do have a slightly outdated version here, so I'll update it now, but you should simply tick this box here, and then once you press apply, this will install all the things you checked onto your machine, and this will install all the tools you therefore need to build Android apps. With that all installed, you can go back to the Ionic documentation to see the rest of the steps. We can use the Ionic CLI to basically add Android as a supported platform in our project. And you do this by, in a terminal, navigate it into your project, running Ionic Capacitor add, and then either iOS or, in our case here, Android. And this will now set this project up such that you can build an Android app with it, to put it simple. It will install an extra package, Capacitor Core, and do a couple of other things in configurations, and actually add a brand new folder with your Android app inside of it. Now, I actually got an error here, that Capacitor could not find the web assets directory, and then this path here. Now, this is pretty normal if you never built your app. Simply run ng-build to fix this. ng-build will now build your Angular app, and you always need to do that before you can turn it into a native mobile app, because you will wrap your finished built app into that native mobile app. So once this build process finished, you got this www folder, and that is exactly the folder that was missing. So let's now rerun Ionic Capacitor add Android. And now this should succeed. So let's wait for that to finish. And here it is. So now it is finished, and you should now have a new Android folder in there. Now, this is the Android app, and this is actually a folder you could now open in Android Studio to launch your app. This is the native app, so to say. It holds all the code for the native app, and it also will hold your web app bundled into that native app. Now, if you have a look at the official docs, you also see what you would do if you were to use Cordova, which I'll not cover here though. For us, the next important step is that we want to set the package ID for this app. You can set that in the capacitor config JSON file. Here it's this app ID, and I will name this here to com Udemy course Ionic Angular. You typically use an identifier that looks like a reverse URL here. And you're free to use any identifier you want. The idea here is that your app has a unique identifier that differentiates it from all the other apps in the App Store. Now with this set up, what we can do is we can run ionic capacitor copy Android. Now, this is a command you should always execute after you created a new build with ng-build. Because ionic capacitor copy Android will basically copy your www folder into this native app and bundle it into that again, so to say. This is a command you have to run before you can run your native app and see it. You can also type ionic capacitor run Android, and what this will do is it will execute all these previous steps for you. It will run ng-build essentially, and thereafter it will copy the www folder into the native app for you, so it does all of that, and it then even opens the Android folder in Android Studio. And that is important because you can launch your app from inside there now. So when this opens for the first time, let it finish all its tasks it's executing there. They should all finish without errors, so let's wait for that to finish. On the first load, this will take a little longer. Subsequent loads will be faster, no worries. And here it did finish. This error here actually is just a warning. We should be fine. And now we can launch our app. Now for that, we need an emulator up and running. And you can go to Tools, AVD Manager here to create one. Now, I already created a couple of virtual devices. Here on the bottom left, you can click on Create Virtual Device to build a new one. Then choose any of these blueprints, like the Pixel 2. Click Next. Choose the latest stable version of Android here. And then simply finish this. You should be able to use all the default settings. Now you can launch such an emulator by clicking that green play button there. And this will now open up that emulator. Here it is. And there you can see your app. Now you can also connect your real device to your computer and turn on the developer options there. After this lecture here, you'll find a lecture where I explain how that works, and then run the app on your real device. That works as well. Here I'll go with the emulator. Let's wait for the emulator to finish booting up. So here it did now finish booting, and now back in Android Studio. Remember, this is the Android folder from our project, which was opened there for us by Capacitor. You can now click that green play icon here, and then choose the emulator or connected device you want to run the app on. And here I'll use that connected emulator, which is already up and running, and press OK. And this will now actually build the native app that wraps your web app and then automatically install it on that emulator or real device and launch it there. So let's wait for that to finish. The build process succeeded. It's now installing this app on the emulator, on the connected device here. And here the app is. Now, the startup time here on my machine is not super fast because I'm also recording and everything, so this machine here is pretty on its limit. It actually does start up quite fast, and you can demo this by connecting a real device because emulators also always are a bit slower. Now here, what we can see though, and again, any lag here is really just caused by me recording. We can see this application works exactly as it should work and exactly as we saw it in the browser. But now this is a real native app on our emulator here, installed as a native app there. Now, for the majority of the course, I will actually keep on developing here with the help of the browser, simply because it's easier to debug, it updates faster, and so on. But being able to build that native app and see it run here, of course, this is a core part of Ionic, and this is how you do go through that process. Now, one note, of course, when you run Ionic capacitor run Android, all these steps are executed for you, and with the emulator up and running, all you have to do is press that play button. But you can also execute Ionic capacitor run Android with -L after it, which stands for live reload. Now what this will do is it will actually not build the app, but run ngserve, and therefore run the same command we used before for having the server to visit it here in the browser. And then it gives you a native app that actually talks to that server running on your Mac or Windows machine, and that will automatically update the app on the native device when your code changes. So you get the same behavior as you do in the browser with live updates on the native device now, and you don't have to rebuild the app after every change you want to see reflected here. Now, from my experience, this live reload process is a bit clunky and sometimes doesn't work perfectly, but generally, this is a nice thing to have and definitely something you should experiment with because it can be really useful and can speed up your development flow. If I now start this app again here, after I started this live reload process and built my app with that, and now with that app running again, if I now change something in code, let's say on the recipe page here, where I have recipes as a title, if I add an exclamation mark and I save that, it will now rebuild because I have that server up and running, which was started by Ionic capacitor run Android -L. And by the way, you can therefore now also connect to that on your browser again, and you will see your changes there. But now this also live updated, as you can tell here, in the native mobile app. And that can speed up the workflow when you want to preview your changes inside of your real native mobile app and not just in the browser. And let me also emphasize one more time, this is a mobile app, as you could install it from the App Store. This is not the browser on the mobile app hosting the web app. This is a custom native mobile app.